Hashtag script, the deadly Game of Thrones, royal assassinations that change history. Have you ever wondered what really happened when a monarch suddenly fell ill in the dead of night? History books tell you they died of natural causes, but the truth is far more sinister. The royal courts of Europe weren't just places of luxury and power. They were the deadliest battlegrounds on earth, where poison, daggers, and elaborate murder plots lurked behind every ornate tapestry. The path to power has always been painted red, and nowhere was this more true than in the royal courts of the past. Today, we're going to examine the most disturbing royal assassinations in history, the ones that textbooks sanitize but that shaped our modern world through blood and betrayal. Let's begin with perhaps the most brutal and calculated royal murder of all time, the assassination of Emperor Peter III of Russia in 1762. This wasn't just a murder, it was a coup orchestrated by his own wife, Catherine the Great. The official story claims Peter died of hemorrhoidal colic after abdicating the throne. But historical records tell a far more disturbing tale. Catherine, tired of her husband's incompetence and eager for power, conspired with her lover, Grigory Orlov, and his brothers. Just 8 days after being forced to abdicate, Peter was visited by Alexei Orlov at the small house where he was being held prisoner. What followed would shock even modern sensibilities. According to accounts that have survived, Peter was forced to drink poisoned brandy. When the poison worked too slowly, the conspirators couldn't wait. Alexei Orlov, a man of immense physical strength, strangled the former emperor with his bare hands while another conspirator crushed his windpipe by standing on his chest. An autopsy was never performed, but those who prepared the body for burial reported horrific bruises around his neck and a distorted face frozen in the agonies of strangulation. Catherine, the grieving widow, shed no tears. She was crowned empress 3 months later and ruled for 34 years, becoming one of Russia's most celebrated monarchs. This wasn't just murder, it was the brutal erasure of a living person from the pages of history, followed by the murderer being celebrated as a national hero. The next time you see Catherine labeled the Great in a history book, remember the bruised body of her husband and how power was truly transferred. But Catherine's rise to power through murder wasn't unique in royal history. It was practically a tradition. Consider the blood wedding of 1572 in France, a mass assassination that makes modern terrorist attacks look merciful by comparison. King Charles IX and his mother Catherine de' Medici orchestrated what began as a royal wedding celebration between Protestant Henry of Navarre and Catholic Margaret of Valois. The wedding was supposed to heal religious divisions. Instead, it became the pretext for systematic slaughter. In the pre-dawn hours of 24th, St. Bartholomew's Day, Catholic nobles and militia entered the homes of Protestant leaders who had gathered in Paris for the wedding. The first to die was Admiral Gaspard de Coligny, a Protestant leader who had the king's ear. Assassins broke into his bedroom, stabbed him repeatedly, and then threw his still-breathing body out the window to the street below. The waiting crowd below didn't just kill him, they mutilated his body, cutting off his head and hands, dragging what remained through the streets, and eventually hanging the corpse by its feet. This was just the beginning. The royal-sanctioned killings spread throughout Paris like wildfire. Protestant men, women, and children were dragged from their beds and murdered. Contemporary accounts describe pregnant women being cut open, their unborn children ripped from their wombs and dashed against walls. Children were forced to watch their parents being dismembered before meeting the same fate. The Seine River ran red with blood for days. Bodies were piled so high in the streets that the stench made parts of the city uninhabitable. King Charles IX, the young monarch who had authorized the slaughter, was reportedly seen at his palace window with an arquebus, personally shooting at fleeing Protestants. By the time the massacre ended, at least 3,000 people had been murdered in Paris alone, with estimates suggesting that up to 30,000 died as the killings spread to other cities. All this carnage orchestrated from the royal chambers, where maps were spread out marking the homes of those to be eliminated. What these stories reveal is that royal courts weren't just places of pageantry, they were perfect killing grounds. The close quarters, the access to exotic poisons, the constant power struggles, and the ability to cover up crimes made palaces more dangerous than battlefields. Consider the case of King Edward II of England, whose 1327 assassination was perhaps the most grotesque in English history. After being forced to abdicate in favor of his son, Edward was imprisoned in Berkeley Castle. His captors, fearful of leaving marks of violence on the former king's body, devised a method of murder so horrific it was concealed from the public for centuries. According to accounts written closer to the time, Edward was held down while a red-hot copper rod was inserted into his rectum through a cow's horn, burning his internal organs without leaving external marks. The screams were so terrible that they could be heard outside the castle walls, but were disguised by the killer's own shout so people would think the king was still alive. This wasn't just murder, it was calculated torture designed to humiliate a divinely appointed ruler, even in death. The perpetrators, Roger Mortimer and Edward's own wife, Isabella of France, ruled England for 3 years afterward, sleeping in the same bed while the murdered king's son was a puppet on the throne. Power and sex have always been intertwined in royal assassination plots. But perhaps no royal court was more deadly than that of the Ottoman Empire, where fratricidal murder wasn't just common, it was legally sanctioned. When Sultan Mehmed II officially encoded the practice of royal fratricide into law, he created a system where princes knew from birth that they would either gain the throne or face the silk bowstring. The most disturbing example came when Mehmed III ascended to the throne in 1595. Within hours of learning of his father's death, he ordered the execution of his 19 brothers, some as young as infants. The method was always the same, strangling with a silk cord, which was believed to preserve royal blood by not spilling it. The young princes were brought one by one to be killed, from oldest to youngest. Contemporary accounts describe how the older boys fought desperately for their lives, while the younger ones, not understanding what was happening, laughed as the executioners approached, thinking it was a game. 7 pregnant concubines were tied in weighted sacks and dropped into the Bosphorus to drown, ensuring no potential rival would ever be born. The bodies of the 19 princes were laid out in rows, wrapped in silk, and buried together in a single ceremony that the new sultan attended, reportedly showing no emotion. This wasn't seen as a crime. It was official policy designed to prevent civil war. The stability of an empire was literally built on the bodies of royal children. What's particularly disturbing about these royal assassinations isn't just their brutality, but how successful they often were. Catherine the Great is remembered as an enlightened ruler, not as her husband's murderer. The Ottoman practice of fratricide helped maintain one of history's longest-lasting empires. The bloodletting in France consolidated power for the Catholic monarchy for another generation. The most effective royal assassinations weren't just killings. They were erasures, removing people completely from history's narrative. And they worked because royal courts were perfect environments for conspiracy. Everyone was bound by mutual interest, secrets, and often by blood relationships that made betrayal both easier and more deadly. Consider the assassination of Tsar Nicholas II and his family in 1918. While this occurred after the Russian Revolution had ousted the Romanovs from power, the manner of their killing reflects centuries of royal assassination traditions. The family was woken in the middle of the night, told they were being moved to a safer location, and led to a basement room. There, a firing squad suddenly opened fire. What most history books don't detail is the horrifying fact that the bullets initially bounced off the women's bodies. The princesses had sewn the family jewels into their corsets, inadvertently creating bullet-resistant vests. The executioners resorted to bayonets, but even these couldn't penetrate the jewel-encrusted clothing. Finally, each family member was shot point-blank in the head. The bodies were then stripped, mutilated with acid, burned, and buried in a secret location that remained unknown for decades. This wasn't just the end of the Romanov dynasty. It was a deliberate obliteration of royal power that had been built through centuries of similar acts of violence. The circle of royal murder was complete. What these bloody episodes teach us is that beneath the veneer of divine right, royal privilege, and courtly manners lurked a ruthless system of power maintenance through violence. The stakes were simply too high for mercy. A single mistake